A first-year nursing student reported a patient's deteriorating vitals to the wrong doctor, and in doing so accidentally saved the life of the most dangerous man in Toronto. What followed wasn't a disciplinary hearing. It was the beginning of something she never could have predicted, something that shook the walls of St. Aldrich's General from the trauma bay to the executive boardroom. The cardiac monitoring unit on the 7th floor of St. Aldrich's General hummed with the particular kind of quiet that hospitals have at 2 in the morning. It was a Tuesday in February, and the kind of cold that settles into your bones had followed Sloane Merritt in through the sliding doors when her shift started at 11. She was 24 years old, in her second placement of her practical nursing program, and still at the stage where she double-checked every medication chart twice and whispered the dosage calculations under her breath like a prayer. She was not supposed to be running a floor on her own. Her supervising nurse, a veteran named Brenda, who smelled of eucalyptus and had the disposition of someone who had seen every possible way a body could fail, had stepped out to deal with a supply issue in the basement. That was supposed to take 10 minutes. It had now been 40. Sloane was doing her rounds when room 714 caught her attention. The man inside had been admitted under a private insurance code that nobody on the floor seemed to want to discuss too loudly. His chart listed him as Rafferty Holdings, a corporate name, not a patient name, and his assigned physician was Dr. Lorne Hastings, a cardiologist who had arrived at St. Aldrich's 3 months ago with credentials so impressive they looked almost curated. The patient's actual name, buried 2 pages into the admission paperwork, was Callum Rafferty. He was 43 years old. He was supposed to be stable. He was not stable, Sloane noticed it the way good nurses notice things. Not from the monitor numbers alone, but from the way his breathing had shifted, shallow and arrhythmic in a way that didn't match the sedative dose he'd been given 4 hours ago. His color was wrong. The capillary refill on his fingertips took a second too long. She checked his chart, rechecked the cardiac readout, and felt the cold, very specific certainty settle into her chest that something was happening in that room that needed to stop happening immediately. She pressed the call button for Dr. Hastings. No answer. She paged him twice. The ward phone rang and rang. The attending on duty that night was Dr. Pruitt, a general medicine physician who had technically no jurisdiction over a cardiac patient under a specialist's care. The rules were clear. Do not cross the consult unless the patient is in immediate life-threatening distress. The rules were also designed for situations where the specialist was actually reachable. Sloane had been raised in Sudbury by a woman who ran a Ukrainian deli and taught her daughters that the people with the official answers were not always the people with the right ones. She pressed Dr. Pruitt's call button. He arrived in 4 minutes, looked at the readout, looked at Sloane, looked at the patient, and said in a voice that was admirably free of panic, "Get the crash cart and get me Dr. O.C. on the phone right now." The next 22 minutes were the kind that leave a mark. Dr. Pruitt caught the arrhythmia before it cascaded. Callum Rafferty's heart, which had been quietly edging toward a ventricular event that would have resolved itself irreversibly, was brought back into rhythm at 2:47 a.m. by a physician who had no business being in that room and a first-year nursing student who had trusted her instincts over her authority. By 3:15, the crisis was over. Brenda had returned from the supply room to find the room reconfigured and the chart flagged with 4 new notations. She looked at Sloane over the top of the nursing station and said nothing. But she made a note in the placement review file that Sloane Merritt had excellent clinical instincts. Sloane didn't think about Callum Rafferty for the rest of that shift. She had 4 other patients, a medication reconciliation that needed finishing, and a bus to catch at 7 in the morning. She found out who he was the next afternoon from a classmate who sent her a link to a Toronto Life profile from 3 years ago. Callum Rafferty was the chairman of the Rafferty Group, which controlled a significant portion of Ontario's private infrastructure contracts, 2 regional ports on Lake Ontario, and a real estate portfolio that had reportedly influenced the zoning decisions of 4 separate city councillors. He was also, according to a source in the article that was quoted anonymously and presumably still alive, the reason that certain conversations in certain circles happened in parking garages rather than boardrooms. Sloane read the article standing in the kitchen of the apartment she shared with 2 other nursing students, thought, well, that explains the private insurance code. She did not expect to see him again. She did not expect to see him. She was wrong. 3 days later, she arrived for her evening shift to find Brenda standing at the nursing station with an expression Sloane had not seen on her face before. Slightly uncertain, almost impressed. "There's someone who wants to speak with you," Brenda said, privately. "He's been cleared through administration. You're not obligated, but—" She paused. "I'd go." The meeting took place in one of the family consultation rooms near the end of the 7th floor corridor. It was a small room with beige walls and the kind of chairs designed to be inoffensive and were therefore deeply uncomfortable. When Sloane pushed open the door, she found 2 men standing near the window. One was large, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that cost more than Sloane's monthly rent. His eyes moved to her the moment she entered and didn't leave. The other man was sitting in one of the uncomfortable chairs. He was taller than she expected. She had only ever seen him horizontal, and though he was still pale, with the careful movements of someone not entirely confident in their own body yet, he radiated the particular stillness of a man who was used to being the most significant person in a room and had stopped needing to announce it. Callum Rafferty looked at her the way she imagined he looked at balance sheets. Thorough, direct, searching for the figure that mattered. "Monsieur's Merit," he said. His voice was even low, a Toronto accent that had been sandpapered smooth but not entirely erased. "I've been told you were the one who flagged the issue in my room 3 nights ago. I noticed the change in your vitals," Sloane said. She stayed near the door. She was not sure why, except that the room suddenly felt smaller than it looked. "Dr. Pruitt made the clinical decision. Dr. Pruitt has told me in very clear terms that he would not have been in that room if you hadn't called him." Rafferty's gaze was unreadable. "Dr. Hastings has been relieved of his position, effective this morning." Sloane absorbed that information. "Okay." A pause. He tilted his head slightly. Most people, she suspected, filled silence around this man. She didn't. "You're a student," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "2nd placement. I graduate in June. And yet you made a judgment call that your supervising nurse, your attending, and my own hired cardiologist failed to make." Sloane kept her voice neutral. "I noticed something. I reported it. That's what the job is." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the adjustment a compass makes when it finds north. "My daughter," Callum Rafferty said, "is going to fail her 1st year at U of T if someone doesn't do something about it soon. She has a diagnostics and clinical reasoning exam in 3 weeks that she has decided, for reasons I am only beginning to understand, to prepare for by watching television and avoiding my calls." Sloane stared at him. "I'm sorry." "She's in 1st year nursing," he said. "At U of T. She applied herself, enrolled herself, and has been determined to do this without my involvement since September, which I have respected." A pause. The word respected carried the weight of something that had cost him. "She is now 3 weeks from an exam that carries 40% of her semester grade, and I have been informed by her roommate, who I paid exactly no money to obtain this information from, that she has not opened the course materials in 11 days. "Mr. Rafferty," Sloane said carefully, "I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because you are the only person I have encountered in recent memory who treated a problem as a problem rather than as a status question," he said. "You didn't call me because of who my chart said I was. You called because something was wrong and needed fixing." He watched her. "My daughter has surrounded herself with people who have been treating her like a Rafferty for her entire life. They don't challenge her, they accommodate her. And she is about to fail an exam in a program she chose because she wants to help people, and no one in her life is telling her the truth about how badly she is falling behind." The room was very quiet. "What exactly are you asking me?" Sloane said. "I want you to tutor her." He said it simply. without the inflection of a request. Evenings 3 times a week until the exam. You will be compensated at a rate that will not require you to take the overnight bus shifts you've been picking up to cover your placement costs. Sloane felt something tighten in her chest. She hadn't told anyone about the overnight bus shifts. How do you know about? I know a great many things, Miss Merritt. He said it without apology. It is how I've managed to remain alive this long, apparently. A dry pause. The rate will be 5 times your current hourly. My assistant will send you the details. I haven't said yes. No, Callum Rafferty agreed. You haven't. Another silence. Sloane thought about the bus shift on Thursday. She thought about the February electricity bill. She thought, briefly and against her better judgment, about the way this man had looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not with the vague benevolence of someone performing gratitude, but with the specific attention of someone who had actually processed what she'd done and why it mattered. I want to meet her first, Sloane said, and I want to be clear with you that if she doesn't want to work, I am not going to sit in a room with her and pretend otherwise. Something that was almost a smile crossed Callum Rafferty's face. Miss Merritt, he said, if you try to accommodate her, you're fired. His daughter's name was Piper Rafferty, and she was 19 years old, and she had the particular energy of someone who had been told they were special from birth and was only just beginning to suspect that this information might have been incomplete. She met Sloane at the door of the Rafferty house in Rosedale on a Wednesday evening, with the expression of someone expecting a process to be endured. Dad sent you, Piper said. It was not a welcome. Your dad hired me, Sloane said. That's not the same thing. Are you going to let me in? Piper stepped back. The house was the kind of large that stops announcing itself. High ceilings, good wood, a kitchen that had been recently renovated in the particular shade of white that suggests someone was trying to make money look casual. There were photographs on the wall near the staircase. Piper at various ages, almost always caught mid-motion, mid-law, rarely looking at the camera. It was the wall of a parent who had been paying attention. I've already read the textbook, Piper said, dropping into a chair at the kitchen table. I know the material. Okay, Sloane said, setting her bag down. Then it'll be a short night. Walk me through the ventilation-perfusion ratio and what happens to it in a pneumothorax. Piper's expression went very still. Take your time, Sloane said. What followed was the kind of silence that answers a question more definitively than words. Piper Rafferty knew the vocabulary. She could gesture at the concept. But the actual mechanics of it, the physiology underneath the terminology, had not been assembled into anything functional. You've read the words, Sloane said, not unkindly. You haven't built the framework yet. That's fixable, but it takes work, and it takes honesty about where you actually are, not where you wish you were. Piper looked at her. There was something complicated in it. Defensiveness, yes, but underneath that, something that looked almost like relief. Like someone who had been waiting for a person to just say the true thing. Everyone keeps telling me I'll be fine, Piper said. You'll be fine if you work, Sloane said. You won't be fine if you don't. That's the actual situation. She opened her own notes on the table. So, VQ ratio. Let's start from the lung base and build upward. The first session lasted 3.5 hours. By the end of it, Piper had filled 6 pages of notes in handwriting that got progressively neater as the evening went on, which Sloane recognized as the physical sign of a brain beginning to organize itself. She was sharp, genuinely, not in the curated way of someone who had been told they were smart their whole life. She saw connections quickly. She asked good questions. She had simply never been required to do the foundational work first. Callum Rafferty appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10 o'clock with 2 mugs of tea. He set them on the counter without disrupting the session and left without saying anything. But Sloane caught the way he looked at his daughter, 2 pages deep in notes, arguing about the clinical presentation of tension pneumothorax with a focus she'd apparently not applied to anything in several months, and the look was not pride, exactly. It was something older and more careful than pride. It was the look of a man who had been worried and was now, cautiously, less worried. The second session happened on Friday. The third the following Monday. They found a rhythm. Piper pushed back, Sloane held her ground, and somewhere in the friction, actual learning started happening. Piper stopped deflecting with vocabulary and started asking the harder questions. She stopped leaving gaps in her reasoning and started noticing them herself. Callum Rafferty was always somewhere in the house during these evenings, though not always visible. Sometimes Sloane would look up from a diagram to find him standing in the hall, glass of water in hand, apparently having stopped in transit for some unrelated reason. Sometimes he asked her questions as she packed up to leave, not about Piper, but about nursing itself, about the clinical reasoning process, about how a person learned to trust their own assessment when the environment was telling them something different. He asked those questions the way he seemed to do everything, directly, without preamble, as if her answer genuinely mattered, and he had no patience for responses that were shaped primarily by what she thought he wanted to hear. "In my experience," he said one night, leaning against the doorframe as she zipped her bag, "the people who are most dangerous to an organization are not the ones who oppose you openly. They're the ones who tell you what you want to hear and then do nothing, or worse." Sloane paused. "Is this still about Piper? A beat?" "It's about most things," he said. She looked at him, really looked the way she'd learned to look at patients, past the surface presentation to the underlying pattern. He was tired. Not the tired of a bad night, but the tired of a long, sustained pressure that had been running for months. There was something about his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, that reminded her of the patients she'd seen sitting in triage who had been in pain for so long they'd stopped noticing it as pain and started experiencing it as weather. "You should be sleeping more," she said, before she'd made the decision to say it. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely caught off guard. "I'm a nursing student," she said. "It's a professional observation." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the structural preparation for one. Noted. She left before the moment could become anything else. On the bus home, she stared at the dark window of the 97 bus and told herself very firmly that she was a 24-year-old nursing student in her second placement, and he was a 43-year-old man who ran a private empire and had been specifically connected to 3 separate municipal investigations in the past 6 years. It didn't entirely work. The trouble arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week, 12 days before Piper's exam, in the form of a man named Desmond Tully. Sloane had learned the name from Piper incidentally, the week before, a former associate of the Rafferty group who had left under circumstances that were described as mutual, and were. Piper had said with the knowing weariness of someone who had grown up in that world, not mutual at all. He had apparently decided that the timing of Callum's hospitalization represented an opportunity, and had made a number of calls to people in the group's infrastructure contacts, suggesting that the chairman's health was more precarious than publicly disclosed. Sloane found this out because on Thursday evening she arrived at the Rosedale house to find 2 security personnel she hadn't seen before stationed in the front hall. And the particular atmosphere of controlled urgency that she recognized from the hospitals on the nights when something had gone wrong quietly and everyone was working hard not to let it go loud. Piper was upstairs. The session happened anyway. Sloane was not going to lose a study evening 11 days before the exam, regardless of the ambient threat level, but at 9 o'clock, one of the security personnel knocked on the kitchen door and asked Sloane to come downstairs. Callum Rafferty was standing in the study off the main hall. The room was wood-paneled and book-lined, and had the contained energy of a space where serious decisions were made regularly. He was on the phone when she entered, speaking in a voice low enough that she caught only the edges, a tone she hadn't heard from him before, quiet and cold and carrying the absolute certainty of someone who did not make threats because threats were inefficient. He ended the call and turned to her. "There's a possibility," he said, "that the situation outside this house becomes more complicated in the next few hours. I want to offer you transport home with personnel, and we will reschedule the remaining sessions." Sloane looked at him. Piper has the exam in 11 days. I'm aware. She's finally in the right rhythm. Another disruption will cost her a week of momentum. Callum Rafferty stared at her. He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to having his risk assessments redirected. Miss Merritt, I'm trying to ensure your safety. I understand that, she said, and I appreciate it, but you hired me to fix a problem, and the problem isn't fixed yet. She held his gaze. What exactly is the risk level we're talking about? A long pause. Manageable, he said finally, contained to our professional sphere, not a physical risk to anyone in this house tonight. Then I'd like to go back upstairs and finish the session. Something moved through his expression, a layering of things that happened too quickly for her to sort. He nodded once, short and precise. She turned to go. Sloane, he said. She stopped. He had never used her first name before. The fact that you asked about the risk level before making your decision, he said. Most people wouldn't have thought to do that. She turned back. His eyes were on her in the direct, complete way they had been on that first night in the consultation room. Not evaluating exactly, recognizing. Most people haven't spent 3 months on a cardiac ward, she said. You learn to assess quickly. She went back upstairs. Piper, who had apparently absorbed more of her father's situational awareness than either of them credited, looked up when Sloane walked back in and said, Is everything okay? Everything is manageable, Sloane said. Open your notes. We're doing clinical decision trees for the last 40 minutes, and I want you to be fast. Piper opened her notes. The situation outside resolved by midnight. Sloane took the arranged car home. She was not impractical about these things, and sat in the back seat watching the city slide past the window, and thought about the way Callum Rafferty had said her name. The weight of it. The deliberateness, as though he had made a decision. The exam was on a Tuesday. Sloane wasn't there for it. She had a shift at St. Aldrich's that she couldn't move, but at 4:17 in the afternoon she received a text from an unsaved number with a Toronto area code. She passed, 83. She called me before she called anyone else. Sloane sat with that for a moment, then she typed back. She did the work. You stayed out of the way long enough for that to happen. 3 minutes passed then. I've been told that staying out of the way is not a skill that comes naturally to me. She smiled at her phone in the break room of the 7th floor, feeling slightly ridiculous, and texted back, It's learnable. He called her the following evening, not a text, a call, which felt deliberate in the particular way that all his choices seemed deliberate, as though he operated with a level of intentionality that most people reserved for major life decisions, and he applied to everything. I'd like to take you to dinner, he said. No preamble, not as a thank you. I want to be clear about that, as an invitation. Sloane was standing in her kitchen again, this time reheating leftover congee, and she thought about the 14 things that were complicated about this. And then she thought about the fact that she had sat across from this man 3 evenings a week for 3 weeks, and had not yet had a single conversation with him that felt like anything other than exactly what it was. I have a shift until 7 on Friday, she said. Friday at 8 then. The restaurant was on King Street West, quiet and very good, with the kind of lighting that suggested it understood its clientele preferred not to be observed. Callum Rafferty was there before her, which she suspected was always the case. He stood when she arrived, a gesture so automatic it clearly wasn't performed, and waited until she was settled before he sat down. They talked for 3 hours. She told him about Sudbury, about the deli, about the specific experience of being the daughter of someone who worked physically hard all her life and finding, in nursing, the version of that ethic that fit. He told her about the port business, the infrastructure contracts, and with careful calibration, some of the other things, the ones the Toronto Life article had only gestured at, with the precision of someone who was not confessing but was also not pretending. You're not what I would have imagined, she said at some point. And what would you have imagined? Someone louder, she said. Someone who needed the room to know he was there. He considered this. I used to be louder, he said. It was exhausting and it attracted the wrong kind of attention. A pause. The right kind of power is quiet. My mother would agree with that, Sloane said. She ran a Ukrainian deli in Sudbury for 20 years and never raised her voice once. Everyone in a 6-block radius was slightly afraid of her. He laughed, a real one, not managed, the kind that arrived before the filter could get to it, and Sloane felt something settle in the back of her chest that she recognized distantly as the sensation of a decision already made. The drive home was in the company car. He sat beside her rather than arranging for a separate vehicle, which she read correctly as intentional. "Piper wants to do her clinical placement at St. Aldrich's," he said as the car crossed Bloor. "In the emergency department. That's a good choice for her," Sloane said. "She thinks fast. She just needs structure. She said the same thing about you," Callum Rafferty said. Sloane looked at him. "She said I think fast." She said, looking ahead, that you were the first person who ever told her something was her fault and made her feel better about herself afterward. The car stopped in front of her building. February had let go slightly. The temperature was still well below zero, but there was less of that deep, bone-dark cold, the kind that makes the city feel like it's trying to discourage you. "Callum," she said. She hadn't used his first name before either. It felt deliberate. It was. He looked at her. "Whatever this is," she said, with the directness she had learned first from her mother and refined in 3 months of clinical placement. "I don't do uncertain. I'm not built for it. If this is a dinner and a kind word and a car home, that's fine. But if it's something else, then you should say so, because I don't have time for things that stay unclear." He looked at her for a moment with the full and undivided attention that she'd come to understand was his most serious expression. "It's something else," he said. She nodded once. "Okay." Then she got out of the car. She was halfway up the front steps of her building when she heard the window come down. "Sloane." She turned. "Next Friday," he said. "If you're free." She was free. She would make herself free, she said. "Text me," and went inside. 6 months later, Sloane Merritt arrived for her final placement evaluation at St. Aldrich's General and was met at the nursing station by Brenda, who handed her a coffee and looked at her over the rim of her own mug with the expression she used when she had filed something away and judged it accurate. "You're getting the commendation write-up this quarter," Brenda said. "Clinical instinct under pressure. Intervention of significant consequence." A pause. "Lorne Hastings filed a formal grievance for what it's worth." "Against who?" Sloane asked. "Administration. Vague. He knows better than to put your name on paper." Brenda took a sip of her coffee. The patient made a call, apparently. Hastings' grievance was resolved accordingly. Sloane looked at her. "I don't ask questions I don't need the answers to," Brenda said pleasantly. "Neither should you." Sloane's final evaluation that semester was the highest in her cohort. She graduated in June, on a day warm enough that Toronto finally remembered it was capable of being generous. Piper Rafferty was in the audience, not with her father deliberately, because she had enrolled herself and been struggling alone and wanted to sit with her own classmates on this day. And she found Sloane afterward and hugged her with the unself-conscious force of someone who had learned something real and wanted the person who taught them to know it. "Don't tell my dad I hugged you," Piper said into Sloane's shoulder. "He would not find that problematic," Sloane said. Piper pulled back and looked at her. Then she laughed, and it was the same laugh as in the photograph on the Rosedale staircase wall. Full motion, no filter, caught mid-becoming, after the convocation crowd had cleared and the photographs had been taken, and Sloane's mother had driven back to Sudbury in the car with the dent in the passenger door that never got fixed. Sloane walked out of the university building into the June afternoon and found a black car idling at the curb. She had asked him not to come to the ceremony. She wanted that day to be hers. He had said without argument that he understood. He was not at the ceremony. He was here now. Callum Rafferty got out of the car when he saw her. He was in a jacket rather than a suit. This was for him the equivalent of casual, and he looked at her across the distance of 20 feet with the specific attention that she had by now learned to receive without looking away. She had earned this, all of it, the degree in her hand, the commendation on file, the man across the street who had the good sense finally to stay out of the way until it was done. She crossed the distance and didn't look back.